Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Kia ora everyone, I hope you're having a good week and thanks for tuning in this week to my podcast Mikkipedia. So today I am talking to Dr. Phil Maffetone and Professor Paul Laursen, probably two people that don't really need a lot of introduction. I've included their bios, their full bios in the show notes for today's show. Now today we're talking about their paper on COVID-19 and metabolic health, which was published in, I think, April this year actually, and I'll include that in the show notes as well. And this conversation took place in September of this year, late September, as Auckland was coming out of about a 2.5 lockdown, or going into 2.5 lockdown. So for those of you who haven't heard of these two guys, I'll give you a little bit of a background. And you know, Dr. Phil Maffetone, he is one of the most sought after practitioners for health and performance, and he's worked with world-class athletes like Mark Allen, who's a 6-time Hawaii Ironman champion. He's worked with entrepreneurs, musicians and producers such as Rick Rubin, helping them optimize their health and their performance. And during his 2 decades in private practice, Dr. Maffetone's he's just a respected pioneer in the field of complementary medicine, and he brings the latest advances to healthcare professionals around the world. And he's a internationally recognized researcher, educator, clinician and author, and you'll see publications from Phil both in the academic literature, but he's got this amazing resource on philmaffetone.com where he has a lot of free information in and around health and well-being. And he is the creator of the MAF method, which stands for maximum aerobic function, and that combines exercise, nutrition and stress to build the aerobic system, the fat burning engine responsible for fueling all of your body's needs. And anyone that's in the LCHF space, Dr. Phil Maffetone is one of the originals. And he's also a musician, actually. My other guest today, who I'm really honoured to speak to, is Professor Paul Laursen. So Paul is an author, endurance coach, high performance consultant and entrepreneur. Paul is also the co-founder of HIIT Science, which is high intensity interval training, and it's a powerful but often misused tool. And he is one of over 20 sports scientists and experts that have come together to deliver the decades of research and real life experience in a textbook, in an online course, and we talk about that course within today's interview. Paul is also the former lead of physiology for the New Zealand Olympic athletes in High Performance Sport New Zealand, and he's adjunct professor of exercise physiology at Auckland University of Technology, and he now resides back in his home country in Canada, as you'll hear us talk about. He's a world-renowned specialist in high-intensity interval training, low-carbohydrate diets, ketosis, heart rate variability, and more. And Paul really was one of the first kind of mentors, I suppose, for me in this low carbohydrate space, and he is very well published with over 135 scientific manuscripts. It's amazing. He's also an amazing athlete, having completed 17 Ironman triathlons, and as a coach as well, so he puts all of his kind of learnings into helping his athletes perform at their best. While he's got a real athletic bent, Paul is super passionate about health as well. So this conversation is all about metabolic health outcomes and COVID-19 as they see it, and anything that we talk about in the interview, those notes will be linked in the show notes. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Phil Maffetone and Professor Paul Laursen. team. It is great just to chat to you this morning. It's very early for me. It's like, well, I say very early. It's 5:30. I'd normally be up and my kind of doing my thing these days. But Paul, what time is it?
It's not too bad for me, Mikki. Good morning. It's still 10:30 on the west coast of British Columbia, Canada.
Nice. That's where you are these days. And Phil, how about you?
Well, it's afternoon here in Vermont, USA, 1:36 p.m.
Nice. In fact, I was going to ask where you are, Phil, because I see you're popping up on my social media feed with your articles and the podcasts that you're doing in and around the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And I see like different locations for you, like Florida as well as Vermont. So I actually wasn't sure.
I'm all around. I've started traveling again, and I will be traveling a lot more shortly as soon as I can navigate that whole thing. And I sometimes write myself a note to remind myself where I am on a given day, which works well.
Yeah. Now, okay, so you're traveling. How is it traveling in the time of COVID, Phil?
It's really strange. Very, very strange. It's not bad because I keep away from people anyway. I keep away from crowds. I keep away from stores, except for the ridiculous hours where I know there's not a lot of people. But you know what you find yourself doing these days, because in the US you go from state to state, and it's not even like Europe anymore, where everything is somewhat similar. In the US, the states now have become real obsessed about rules, and they change all the time. And so when my phone tells me, welcome to such and such a state, I think, okay, from what I remember, this is what you're supposed to do. And so if I get stopped because I had a Florida license plate, which was a real issue for a while, you have to come up with these stories to avoid, I don't know, getting in trouble. It's really scary in a sense.
And is it quite different from state to state right now, Phil? And that was one thing I was actually going to ask both of you, is what it's like where you're at. And I'll just, in New Zealand right now, we are in our version of level 2.5, I think. And we're going to level 2 tonight, actually, which just means that there are restrictions on the number of people that can go into restaurants. And we have to wear a face mask when we're on a bus or on any public transport. And those are the main restrictions. Obviously, we've got, border control restrictions, but the rest of the country are in level 1, which essentially means no restrictions, but they are encouraged to wear a mask. And it's really difficult to keep up with the rest of the world, to be honest, as to kind of where they're at and what restrictions are kind of in place. Paul, what's it like in British Columbia?
Well, I'm in Revelstoke, BC, and we're in a little bit of a bubble that's kind of like New Zealand in a way, where it's there's a lot big spaces. When we go into the grocery store, there's maybe, it really depends on the time that you go in there, whether people are going to be wearing masks or not. There's no real restrictions. I mean, my daughter's starting back in swimming again. So,
nice.
There's kind of these minor restrictions and stuff, but it's more or less sort of, back to normal a little bit, with some people still wearing masks. But yeah, I think we're fairly progressive from that standpoint. And I mean, we're going to get to probably our different philosophies on where we should be with these things shortly. But yeah, I think it's, again, I'm in a bubble. We're really fortunate. So probably not experiencing the same things that Phil is. And it sounds like, Mikki, you're the same in New Zealand, where it's not too different than what it was normal, except maybe with the exception of international travel. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Phil, how about you for Vermont right now? Are there major restrictions on you being there, or well, not you being there, but for the people in Vermont?
Well, I'm not really sure. The thing about the Northeast US is that everything is so close,
Mm,
Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, where my daughter lives, New York State even, where my son lives. They're really just down the road. And so I I don't really keep track of what's going on because they change all the time.
mm,
Um, I do have to be aware. I have a mask in my pocket, and if I'm going to a health food store and they only let me in with a mask, then I put it on. Other than that, I don't I don't use it, and I don't go to a lot of places that like most restaurants and places that are just unhealthy places. I avoid those anyway. So,
mm,
but what's been happening for 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 a while now here, at least my experience, and I've heard this from other people, is that it's not. It's one thing when the store enforces, they say you have to wear a mask because that's our policy, and they're a private company; they can do anything they want. But when citizens say something to you on the street that you're not wearing a mask, that's pretty offensive.
mm,
It's pretty, it's a frightening thing, I'm not going to tell you what it reminds me of. The social, restrictions have gotten so, people have panicked so much that they're enforcing laws themselves,
mm.
or trying to. And what can you say when you hear that? I try to pretend I don't hear it. And I haven't encountered anything more serious than that, but it's frightening. Um, so I went to New York City, strangely enough, recently. I finally got a slot in a recording studio I've been trying to get into, but was closed because of COVID. So I've recorded a new album, but I had to get to New York City to do it, and that was a place where I didn't see anybody on the street who didn't have a mask. Um, and getting into the city and getting back out 2 days later and staying overnight in the city was not an easy experience.
Mm. It was, I was in New York in November last year actually, because we did the marathon, and that was my second time there, and it was a fantastic experience. And I just can't imagine what it might be like there right now, and actually what it might have been like 3 months ago in the height of kind of the pandemic, I suppose, in a city like New York, which thrives on people, on crowds, on busyness, and just I can't imagine how that might be, like how that changes, but also how heightened some of that kind of energy might have been in a not particularly positive way because of that additional layer of fear that everyone is feeling, which compels people to make comments about you not wearing a mask, and
Yeah,
when you
huge amount of stress
mm,
in the population, and that has been a big problem because of these personal things, the personalities that come out from people, and then also, what that stress does to people, which we may end up talking about in terms of
yeah,
immune function. Um, and I mean, we can go on and on, talk about the social components of um, this problem. Recently, and I can't remember which politician, and I don't look at the news or listen to it, but I have recently been doing that because I will write a COVID article, um, a general article, which we will blast out. So I want to look to see what the media is talking about, which is a painful thing sometimes. But somebody was talking about, a politician was talking about the civil liberties that are the effect on our civil liberties during this COVID experience, and those the stress on our civil liberties has not been this bad for a long time in the country's history. And so, this is an issue that other people are recognizing. You don't hear about it very much. I was surprised to see that headline. But and of course the dysfunction that you hear, from governmental agencies who sometimes, I saw something that the CDC had posted a whole thing about COVID and how the virus is transmitted, and then they took it down off their website because they changed their minds. It's a crazy time.
I totally agree, Phil. And it's that whole, that you were surprised that they were speaking about civil liberties. Just totally, what popped into my head was the fact that no one is talking about health. No one who should be talking about health, who can actually make a meaningful difference with regards to potentially policies or recommendations. People who, like news outlets who can't make policies, obviously, but can actually just increase awareness. Like, all the talk about health is coming from the likes of both of you, obviously, with regards to your paper that you published in the Frontiers of Public Health. But it's almost like speaking about health. If you speak about health, then you're in this camp of slight conspiracy theorist. You're not on the team of people, in New Zealand, we're a team of 5 million. And that team of 5 million needs to wash their hands and wear their masks. But don't go mentioning anything about vitamin D, because if you do, then you need to, check your privilege at the door, basically. It's this whole strange...
and you can't hug or kiss.
No. It's interesting, isn't it? So I want to jump on your paper, actually. I'm just going to ask the really basic question of what inspired you to write it?
Well, I think it was me, Phil, that started it off. I think I was off for a run one time. I think Phil said, Phil's got too much time on his hands, obviously, because he came to me and said, you got any ideas for papers? And I'm pretty sure I was on this run. I was like, what's going on with this whole COVID thing right now? Have you seen this coming up? Because if you look at when we wrote that paper, like we published that, I think it was like end of February, early March, right? Like, this is early days. So we were kind of on to things a little bit early. And I think I saw this coming, correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, but I saw this kind of coming on in January. And I was like, Phil, what's this all about? And I think I asked him the question, does this connect to the overfat? And Phil's like, well, 100%, absolutely it does. And we're like, we better get on something soon. And I remember the month of February was just intense because it was back and forth so many times to get this thing out pretty quick. So it was really, I guess, we were inspired to write it because we were like, if there's a time, then we need to kind of get together as a public, in the world to solve this thing. Like, now is the time. It's like, okay, now we can really see the importance of this, everyone. And so we obviously did that, but it goes back to where you guys were talking about before, with the fact that no one wants to be on the team that pushes towards fixing our health, because everyone's not healthy. 80% of the population is over fat. So who wants to go and do all the hard work to do that? Let's just wear a mask and and not it's physical distance, etc. So
yeah, let's wear a mask, keep 6 feet away, no hugging, no kissing, but eat a lot more junk food than we were before, because well, we can't go to a restaurant unless there's a drive-through. That's the way it is here, or was here, and the result, and then people are working at home. A lot more people are working at home. And there was something in, I think it was the New York Times, that said, people are working at home now and they're filling their refrigerator with foods that normally would be in a vending machine. And, it's a good point. And we don't have any data on, how much more overfat has the population of the world become as a result of COVID. But I almost can guarantee that it's been a significant problem.
Interesting, Phil, and I'll want to get you guys to elaborate on your paper and just describe to the listeners who might not have read it. And of course, I'll pop a link on it to the show notes for this episode, but just to elaborate on what your paper kind of detailed. But what I will tell you is almost every single client that I've seen since our first lockdown have talked about, it's like the freshman 15. They've gained their lockdown 5 kilos that they are now struggling to lose. And it's that combo of, I need to treat myself. I need something to feel better because I can't go out and be with my friends. And this is in no way, shape or form blaming people, because I think we're all human. This is kind of our coping mechanism, right? Can't go out to a restaurant to drink. I need some kind of delineation between work and finishing work during the day, and a glass of wine is going to do that, going to signal to me that I'm going, it's the end of the work day, because you can't leave to go anywhere because you're working from home. And of course, if you are confined to, 300 square meters or whatever your house is, you've got this massive reduction in that like non-exercise activity thermogenesis, just moving during the day. It's just not happening for so many people. But do you want to kind of talk through kind of the premise of the paper and just the types of things that you guys discussed in there?
Sure. I'll kick off and have a go, and Phil, and then you can come in and clean up. Basically, Phil and I've been privileged to be working with Phil and on his Overfat papers over the last, we've done 5 or 6 of these, and basically, overfat is what we believe is much better term, better describes the situation of having like just too much body fat on you. Very simply, you're at a disproportionate amount of body fat than you should have, right? So there can be overfat, there can be normal fat, and underfat. You can also have not enough. And fat's a really important organ ultimately on the body that we need to have in homeostasis and balance. And, of course, the more common terms we use are obesity, or obese, and overweight. These terms, they're more ingrained in us, but they're really kind of derived from the scale. And remember that we've got lots of different tissues on our body, right? Like muscle, water, all the various things. And these can really skew what we can actually get when we step on the scale. And unfortunately, it doesn't really tell a good picture. So when we look at big studies, like we often do, Mikki, we're looking at the not good data ultimately, because we're so many more studies, like probably 90% of the studies use just the scale ultimately to classify people according to body mass index, BMI, and whatnot. So we believe we got to measure what matters, and what you should be measuring is the amount of body fat that you have, the percentage of body fat, and there's better tools than others to determine that amount. But anyways, we've when you have this fat level disproportionate, and certainly overfat is the biggest problem. When you have that in a disproportionate amount, it's really curbing so many different issues in the body. And, you know, these range from, it has ties to your cardiovascular disease, stroke, you know, obviously diabetes, because this is usually probably one of the underlying causes of it, in, you know, abnormal blood sugar levels, cancers, dementia, and yeah, it's, you know, sugar and processed food is probably the underlying thing that's kind of causing that. And and then the new perfect storm that we're getting to is the fact that the immune system is tightly regulated by having, you know, good levels of body fat, or it's not working or not functioning well. If you've got abnormal levels, you get a dysfunction of the immune cells that are, you know, directly linked with that fat store. So that's the premise, I think, of the paper in a nutshell, is that, hey, it's like we're saying, hey team, we're you know, 80% of the population in the world on average is over fat. And now this new novel coronavirus that's coming in, COVID-19 causing, and we better do something about this in the future if we're going to be able to fight it. So it's a bit of a wake-up call paper. Did it have an impact? Doesn't seem to have too much, unfortunately. It's just business as usual, unfortunately, as we spoke about.
Well, it's interesting. Like on the Frontiers website, there are 53,000 people have viewed it.
53,000, yeah. There's a bigger world than that, but
yeah, I know.
Yeah,
I know. I looked at that.
The only government, I will say, just this came through today, is Sweden. Actually, this Michael Eads was just tweeting that, you know, they've attained herd immunity and they're kind of back to normal there. So they're the only ones that kind of did things right. It almost seems they took a real gamble, right, to do something different than the rest of the world. Well, you in New Zealand, them in New Zealand, I guess, a little bit.
Well, New Zealand to a point, because New Zealand, yes, because we're small and we are an island and we can shut our borders. What's going to happen when we open our borders? But you can't mention Sweden, because you might then be shoved in the camp of conspiracy theorist and not a team player, unfortunately. Now, I have a question for you on when you began, and this might be one for you, Phil, but of course, Paul, you weigh in as well. Like, overfat is such a brilliant way to describe it, because you are describing the problem, you know, absolutely. And I have heard another way to describe it is under-muscled. So, you know, I think in both, and I think in terms of under-muscled quite a bit as well, particularly with when I'm chatting to people kind of one-on-one, and I know that outside of the food, and this is not news to you, but even us athletes aren't probably doing a lot of what we need to be doing to preserve muscle and bone mass as we age. You know, training for a marathon doesn't necessarily do that. So I try in all of my conversations to use the term overfat, but my default has been overweight and obesity forever, you know, 20 something years. And when I'm getting much better when I'm teaching my students and talking to them about excess body fat. Has the term been picked up where it matters? You know, like I see it in literature now. I see the term overfat more so than just the papers that you guys published and put out there, which is great. But I feel like it's something that needs to, I don't know, it's like anything, I suppose, that is relevant in health. It kind of needs to move from the paper into the atmosphere, into the public health kind of scene, if you like, for anyone to actually to appreciate it more, because there's a lot of stigma attached with overweight and obesity in those terms, and people don't like them because of the limitations that you mentioned, Paul, of, you know, well, I'm not overweight because I'm, you know, I've got this muscles. That's not really, you know, it's a bit of a meaningless term, and more people are appreciating that now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I was tweeting some of these things that Phil and I were publishing in more of an open forum like that, there was definitely some, I don't know if what's the right term is, is people that were obviously offended, right? So because they're in that category, and so yeah, you can obviously offend people that are in that sort of situation. I don't know what the solution is. Like, we're trying to kind of help, right? Like,
Many people are offended still by the term overfat. They think we're calling them fat, which of course we're not. We're using a scientific word, but that stigma, that leftover stigma from decades of use, calling people fat. It's a slang 4-letter word, really. Is not what we're doing. We're providing a scientific term that defines a condition, a problem of excess body fat that impairs health.
Yeah.
And I've used the word overfat for most of my career, and I think I've mentioned somewhere along the way that I first saw the word in a journal, in a scientific paper somewhere. It was used as a 2-word definition of people that had excess body fat, and it was sort of in parentheses kind of thing. And I thought that's the word, or that's put these together, and it's the word because it better describes what I was starting to see. And back when I first began 40 years ago, you didn't have a lot of overfat people, but you were seeing them, and some of them were normal weight according to the charts, and their BMIs were within normal limits. And so it wasn't a huge problem, but it kept getting bigger and bigger over the years. And today I'm seeing it more and more in manuscripts, in published pieces. Paul and I are referenced often in the literature, and the word overfat usually comes along with that in their descriptions. Some of them, some of the researchers are still caught up in well, we've got overfat, but what do we do with all this data that we've all been using for decades on obesity, which is available to researchers? And if you want to do research, you want to use something that has a lot of numbers, so that it's a weird situation. And I think we're in a transition phase where we're finally moving away from, some researchers have never heard the term overfat. And if they're in this arena doing research, shame on them, sorry, but this information is out there, and it's quite scientific. So, we're seeing the transition, and whether the media picks up on this or not, and more, hopefully they will. It's got to find its way into the mainstream.
And it's not just overfat, right? It's, Paul, you mentioned 80% of people would fall into this category, and then of course you've got 88% of people in North America are metabolically unhealthy. So it's not just that they have excess body fat. They've got, dyslipidemia. So they've got cholesterol that's not working in their favor. They've got that elevated blood sugar, hyperinsulinemia, so high insulin levels. And if we bring it back to COVID, what I find really interesting is that we talk about COVID being most, like the severity of the disease, we see most often in our older population who have other conditions as well, but like other health conditions, which obviously make them a vulnerable population. But then also there are people who are in our age group, so in their kind of 40s and younger, and slightly older, if we're thinking about all of us.
Thanks, Mikki.
Yeah, that's you're welcome, Phil. But often if you make a comment about, well, it's only the sick and the vulnerable, people are like, oh, but this 40-year-old, he got it, and he got it real bad, for example. So it's not just the sick and the vulnerable, but actually at 88% of us who are metabolically unhealthy, I think probably it is still the sick and the vulnerable. It's just we're not thinking about it in the way that a lot of people think about it because of how prevalent poor health is in the general kind of population.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
I think that 88%, Mikki, is a little distorted, because when they look at these things, they kind of look at the people who are chronically metabolically ill.
Yeah.
So they don't just have one condition; they have two or more abnormalities, and so that's years into metabolic impairment. And so we looked at the number of overfat people in the U.S. and it was 91% in adults.
Wow.
And hypothetically, that should be the number of people who also have metabolic impairment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to your point, Mikki, the only thing couple of things I was gonna add on that was that, there's chronological age, but then there's, I don't know, there's health age, right? And that's really what happens, right, when you develop these comorbidities. Like we're kind of all going there, right? Like, let's say the amazing life is you're living to 110 kind of thing with absolute perfect metabolic health, right? But you're still, I think a lot of the longevity data will still support you're still developing these issues, right? Like we're all rusting and oxidizing and aging at the end of the day. But if you're living out of the vending machine type fast food lifestyle, well, you're really speeding up you're speeding up your way towards that end point, right? Or one of those metabolic endpoints, I guess, ultimately. Yeah. And I think back to the like a really important piece of data that's revealed. I know you saw it because I saw you retweet it, but it was nine. It's just gone under the carpet, of course, right? Like, so the CDC data comes out. 94% of those that have sadly passed with coronavirus had 2.6 on average comorbidities reported, right? So it's like, it's just so, it doesn't get any clearer than this. Yeah. So like, that's the problem.
Yeah. And with to Phil's point about how people are offended by the word fat, like it's a 4-letter word, it's almost to the point where if you mention a comorbidity alongside corona and it's to do with diabetes or cardiovascular disease, or mention anything around what people might be able to do to help support their immune system, suddenly you're blaming the individual, so there are so many different stones.
It's like you're stabbing their ego, right? Like it's an ego thing, and no one likes to have their ego broken. And
even mentioning the fact that these comorbidities, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, almost all of these conditions are preventable conditions. Pretty well known that they are preventable, and just saying that can offend people.
I know.
It's really sad, the level of understanding that the world has about health, and as if they can't do anything about things.
And I think because we use the term prevent, people suddenly think, hang on, I should have prevented this myself, rather than kind of, when I'm thinking about the word, these are preventable, I'm thinking much more upstream, like, it's an individual issue, but but the upstream impact of policies in place, of the environments people live, of the access to information that people have around diet, even though we now have, globalization and this whole technology thing has allowed us all of this access to information. It's almost too much for some people. So it doesn't clear that, it doesn't clear anything up for them. It almost confounds
how
everything.
You choose, right? How do you choose which, rabbit hole you want to go down, right?
Yeah.
Do I go and believe what Mikki and Phil believes, or do I go and believe, someone else? It's not easy.
Yeah, and the other component of prevention is, the definition is pretty clear. However, public health has gone off and come up with their own definition of prevention, which is not what all of us would talk about. They define prevention as screening for disease. So, go to your doctor once a year and get screened for disease. You go in and you see your doctor, and you're evaluated, and the report is, you don't have any disease today, come back next year, we'll see if you have any disease. Well, that's not prevention. That's waiting for disease to occur so that it can be treated.
Yeah.
And that's just not what it's all about. And that's become the norm. That's how people think about prevention, and that's obviously not what it is.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. So, in light of the issue around overfat, and you mentioned, Paul, about the immune-related issues. So, that's going to, if you've got excess body fat, that's going to impair your immune function, and everyone is holding out hope for a vaccine. So what's your understanding of the impact that, have you seen any information around the effectiveness of vaccines with regards to level of body fat or anything like that?
Well, I think we actually quote one of the studies in the Overfat, or the Perfect Storm paper, where we're actually it shows that the effectiveness of a vaccine is influenced by your level of overfat or comorbidities, right? So this is the big problem, as I see it, is coming in. So now you've got all these, and I think there's already some hiccups in the vaccines that they're trialing. And this is probably the problem that they're coming up with, is that you're giving these vaccines to people with overfat, that have overfat and comorbidities. And lo and behold, the same problem is they're not, they're not able to mount an effective immune response and beef up their innate immune system, right? Which is the whole kind of goal of it. So yeah, because their adaptive immune system is just is messed up, because they've got these dysregulated fat cells ultimately.
And as part of our reactive society, we have a pandemic, and then we respond by trying to find a vaccine. We have a heart attack, and we respond by doing these procedures and taking these drugs. We have comorbidities, and we get each one of them treated by a specialist, rather than say, hey, what is, like you said, Mikki, what are the upstream problems? What are the more primary problems or problem? And if we put all these things together, the COVID-19 pandemic, the high rate of metabolic impairment, the high rate and the rising rate of chronic disease, which is pretty clear, and it's now overtaken in the developing world. It's now overtaken starvation and malnutrition, and infectious diseases. What is more primary? And overfat is, if you keep looking higher and higher at what's causing what, overfat becomes one of the really high things on that list. What overfat does is it trickles down to three primary things. One is it produces chronic diseases. It increases physical disability and pain, and it increases your risk for chronic infection. And so, rather than wait for a chronic infection and trying to figure out if somebody's got a vaccine, or any of the other examples I gave, let's take a step up and say, hey, if we really want to prevent all these other things, we can address overfat. And there's two ways of doing that. People can take it upon themselves to manage their own health and change it, because virtually everyone who's overfat can do something in their lifestyle and significantly reduce their body fat levels. And number two, the politicians and the public health world can say, hey, we're gonna kick in, we're gonna help out, we're gonna tax junk food and untax fruits and vegetables. We're gonna make it a lot harder for children and anyone to buy junk food. In fact, we're gonna pay you to be healthy.
Mm.
And if they paid everyone to be healthy, and it was followed up and measured, the world would save a lot of money.
Mm.
We obviously haven't evaluated the whole world in that scenario, but there are studies about paying people to be healthy, and they've shown them to be very, very effective, and not just physiologically, but cost effective as well. So we give you $10 to be healthy this month, and we're going to save $12 in the process. What a deal!
Mm-hmm. You just imagine if they put like just a portion of the billions that they've put into vaccine development into some of these initiatives.
Mm.
What a just in terms of effectiveness, like how much what a difference it would make. But,
I know, and you're right. Like the whole health system is geared towards treatment, and so you're absolutely right. When Phil was talking about prevention before, that's not actually prevention. You're right. That's the detection, isn't it, of the disease. And that's the problem, is that when you treat something, you've got a very real outcome. But when you are quote unquote treating over fat, that outcome, it's very it's not a short-term kind of, look, we've done it, tick box thing. It's something that is it's a lifetime change for people. And you're not going to see the immediate impact of what you're doing in the next month. Like, you'll see those savings in maybe 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and people always want to kind of see.
Phil always corrects me with this. That's what I've always thought too, Mikki. But Phil says that you actually can see changes rather quick. And
Really?
Phil, you might want to comment there. But within
measurable. We're not talking about.
Yeah,
we're not talking about, hey, how are you feeling today? I think I feel better. We're talking about measurable changes. For example, two common ones, which are serious conditions: hypertension and high blood fats, high triglycerides. High triglycerides are easy. You don't put anybody in danger. If you make a significant change in a person's diet, if they make a significant change in what they're eating, they could reduce a triglyceride level that's super high down to normal in a week or two.
Yeah, that's pretty
Not
good.
Unusual.
So,
I've seen it so many times.
Right away.
Yeah. And in the case of hypertension, when I suggest people go on the 2E test, which is my evaluation that people can, self-evaluation that people can use to feel how it feels to eat healthy food only and avoid all junk, I warn them to monitor their blood pressure or go to their doctor to have their blood pressure monitored carefully. Because if they're on medication, especially, and they make a change, their blood pressure can normalize very quickly as well. And if they're on medication and their blood pressure normalizes, now they're hypotensive, and that's a serious problem. So these changes obviously occur very quickly, and there's a lot of other ones that do as well. And it's amazing to see people make these transformations with not just hypertension if they have it, or high triglycerides, but lots of physical conditions, lots of biochemical problems, lots of mental, emotional problems that change rather quickly. Sometimes they may take a little longer than quickly, but they change nonetheless, and it's amazing to see.
That's Phil. That's such a good point. It's almost like, and I'm thinking about my own what I was saying before, and it's almost like this rhetoric. It's like you've always known that prevention takes forever, so that's why you don't go through the route. It's almost like a bit of a blockage in your brain as to why aren't they doing it? Oh, because it takes too long. Okay, so
it's a common excuse. Well, who has time to do that?
yeah.
Or maybe when I retire, I'll go on a diet.
Yeah. Now, Phil, you mentioned your 2 week kind of diet experiment, which is not what you called it, but that's the only thing that's coming to my mind right now.
2 week
And you
test.
just said it like 2 minutes ago. And I was actually going to ask both of you, what are some really simple things that people can do to kind of, I guess, take a little bit of control back on their health with their feeling like they're in this space where they need to do something, but they're not sure where to head. And I think that your 2 week kind of reset is probably one of the best things that people could do. Do you want to talk people through what that looks like for those who haven't come across it, Bill?
Sure. It's basically, what I learned early on in practice was that people, you can explain things to people, you can tell people what they should and should not eat, and on and give them a diet, which is always a terrible thing to do. But until they experience feeling better, you often don't have their attention.
Mm.
And so I came up with this idea that would quickly change their physiology and put them in a state where they were clearly healthier, and then how they felt physically, mentally, and then if they had measurable conditions, how they changed, like I mentioned. You'd get their attention, and it worked that way. And so what they do is stop eating junk food, and they write down all their complaints. What problems do I have? I'm depressed. I don't sleep well. I'm tired all day. I'm hungry all day. I'm craving sugar. I'm craving caffeine because I'm so tired. I need to stay awake, et cetera, et cetera. I have pain, and then they get rid of the junk food. They start eating more high quality fats, healthy fats. They start eating more protein, and any of the carbohydrates they consume are natural carbohydrates. But they even stay low on those just to make sure their insulin levels don't jump up. And then over a 2-week period, they monitor themselves, and after 2 weeks, they compare what they were complaining about to how they feel today. Is their pain better? Are they sleeping better? Is their energy better? Their hunger gone? And so forth. And they are often a new person. And then after that, they experiment a little bit with natural carbohydrates, and I've picked carbohydrates because they immediately change the body.
Mm.
So they start adding a carbohydrate every other meal to avoid the second meal effect with regards to insulin, and they may have a small piece of fruit after lunch, and then see how they feel afterwards. It's the only time I recommend, if people want to get on the scale. If they lose weight, much of it is body fat, as studies have shown. But I just do that because any little bit of encouragement is going to be helpful. And when they see that, they're pretty excited, and they often say, well, I need to buy new pants after 2 weeks because I've lost 20 pounds, which is not common, but it happens a lot. I've seen people lose 25, 30, 35 pounds after 2 weeks. Someone who has a big metabolic problem, and then this gives the individual a much better sense of how food influences them, and influences many, many signs and symptoms. And I have something called the 2-week ketogenic test, which I pretty much recommend now for anyone who is over fat, because they can kind of skip over the process where they, experiment and then they slowly add foods back. And because if they're already over fat, they're very insulin resistant. They're carbohydrate intolerant, so they don't tolerate very many carbohydrates. And it's a good way to kind of speed up that whole process. And then what happens often is they become more intuitive, more sensitive, more, their instincts kick in, and they'll be eating a small piece of fruit, and they'll just say, "Oh, this doesn't feel right anymore." And they'll be able to make adjustments, fine-tune their diet, and live happily ever after, so to speak. Which quite often that's what happens. The big problem is in some people is they're addicted to sugar. And they get all excited after 2 weeks because they're feeling like a new person. Another 2 weeks go by, 3-4 weeks, they've lost now a lot of weight. They've got to buy all new clothes. They're off medication, or they're cut way down on medication, whatever. And they are at a get together, and there's this big chocolate cake, and they can't help themselves. And, it just starts that whole vicious cycle of them waking up the next day. Oh, I'm going to just have a little piece of this muffin, and suddenly it's all gone, and they are back to where they were in a short period of time.
And I just suppose it's if they are in tune with how food makes them feel, or at least this is what I see with clients, but they've also got that social support around them as well to help with their kind of diet behavior change. And hopefully when they do dive into that chocolate cake, they wake up the next morning and they have this massive hangover from the sugar and the fat combo that makes them go, you know what, that actually made me feel pretty rubbish. But you're right, Phil, because what they're fighting now is that whole dopamine response from sugar that they got. So they're like, I feel bad, but I want more. So it's ideally in and around what they're doing with their diet, they've got some other structures in place to help them habitualize.
You're right.
And break those years of dietary patterns.
It's not just something it's not like flipping a switch. I wish it was. But there are people who are able to do the 2-week test or make the changes that need to be made, and they're fine. And it's hard sometimes, but they're okay, and they sometimes mess up, but they're okay. Yet they still have this sugar addiction. They still are unable to walk past a bakery without looking and drooling at those things in the window. That takes a long, long time. I think in me, it took years before I was able to, for example, eat a piece of cacao without spitting it out, because it's so bitter to people who are sugar addicted, because the taste buds in their tongue are turned on for sweet, and those cacao things are pretty the other end of the scale. And when your sugar addiction leaves, your taste buds change, and you just munch on cacao whenever you feel like having a snack.
Do you know, I had to chuck out my first block of 85% lint, and it came direct from like Switzerland as well. I'm like, what is this? I can't eat this. It's so bitter. And now I'm like, oh, this is sweet. You see, you're so right on that. Phil, can I just get you, before I'm just going to shift to you, Paul, but Phil, can you describe or explain that second meal effect of insulin? Because I don't know that people will be that familiar with how insulin, what that actually is.
Sure. The body responds to a meal, and one of the responses is releasing insulin. The body responds with insulin release based on the meal you're eating right now, plus the previous meal. And I've had a lot of people become aware of this because they say, I decided to do what you said, and I just said, okay, I'm going to start eating, and they would, they'd have a really healthy dinner or a really healthy lunch, and they'd feel exhausted. And, they'd call me up and they'd say, hey, you said I was going to feel better. I had this meal. I fell asleep at my desk. What's going on? Well, what'd you have for breakfast? Well, I had my usual pancakes. And so that's the second meal effect. And it's a very real thing. It's sometimes quite powerful in some people, less so in others. And there's another component to this, which is, if we consume excess protein, we can convert certain glucogenic amino acids to glucose. And that's very high amounts of protein, but it can happen. And when people reduce the carbohydrates in their diet, because they're trained to not eat fat, to think fat's bad, so they don't eat much fat, and what's left is protein. They end up sometimes eating way too much protein, and that problem can occur.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Paul, anything that you would add to that?
No, the only thing I would add is it's really more of the Phil Maffetone show, but is Phil, this is maybe I'm speaking to the I don't know, maybe someone who wants even a little bit more information, and I'm so grateful to have Phil write chapter 7 in Hit Science for Martin and I. And so you can go to hitscience.com and specifically search up the athlete health and HIT course. And Phil teaches that. So you can actually get the whole course from Phil's whole course. During the coronavirus perfect storm, we're actually making it free to everyone. So you just check out if you want to actually take Phil's course there. And the checkout coupon code is Health for All. And it kind of goes into even more detail just on all the micros, the macros, issues with stress, and if you want even more information to arm yourself. Knowledge is power, right? So the more information you can kind of get about how to make yourself healthy, the more you can equip yourself to, just really have a healthier life, and of course, as we're saying, is defend yourself against the coronavirus.
Yeah, 100%. And what I'll do is if you flip me that code and a web address, Paul, I'll be able to pop that in the show notes. And finally, I got a question from someone when I put a shout out, and they asked about your advice, because of course you guys both sit in two camps, a little bit like me, I suppose. So athlete health and athlete performance, but of course we recognize that an athlete cannot perform if they're not healthy. But of course we're really interested in population health as well, which we've been focused on for the last 40 or so minutes. But with regards to the athlete, what's your advice for athletes with regards to training when there's no racing? How are you working with your athletes right now? And there may or may not be races on the horizon for them, but what are some of the issues you're coming up with for both of you? And how are you supporting them, and what are you suggesting?
Well, with the overfat pandemic, what we are seeing, unfortunately, is a lot of athletes who are also overfat. And that happens to correlate with their needs as an athlete, especially for endurance athletes. One of their needs is to generate more energy so their muscles can perform better. And the best way to do that is to provide fat as an energy source. So fat oxidation is a powerful source of energy for athletes. And there are two things that influence it in significant ways. One is the diet, as we've been talking about, and the other is to reduce training intensity, because lower intensity levels in training increase the use of fats for energy, and higher intensity levels reduce the use of fats for energy.
Awesome. And it's actually like the perfect time to do it if there are no races on the horizon, isn't it? You know, like if
It
there's
is,
no
yeah.
time to work.
Yeah, it is. Although even without COVID and having the races come back, athletes need to plan ahead. They need to say, okay, I'm gonna build my aerobic system and burn a lot of fat, so that when I do go in a race, I'll be more prepared from an energy standpoint. My anaerobic fibers, my power fibers, will be better supported because I'll have a better aerobic system. And so I'll have this 3, 4, 5, 6 month period of so-called base building, which comes from Arthur Lydiard, of course. And then I'm going to start my anaerobic, my higher intensity training and racing, which will go through a certain amount of time, and then I'll eventually return to a so-called off season and rebuild my base or build more aerobic base after that.
Nice.
Yeah, and I will just add on there that that's definitely my philosophy as well. That the base is what we need to build first and foremost. But yeah, I mean I'm certainly supplementing my athletes with a small dose, a small weekly dose of HIIT training as well. And again, the rationale behind that is to stimulate your larger fast twitch motor fibers, and you can actually turn those and make those more oxidative, better fat burners. You kind of transition those from your type 2 A fibers into even more sort of a slow twitch phenotype. And then also the ventricular, the cardiac output that you get as well is quite substantial. So you can kind of continue to increase your VO2 max. And even often some of the guys that I'm coaching, they've hit absolute personal bests in the laboratory. So it's been that's been our target. We've been working on Strava segments, virtual races, but a lot really for a lot of the high-end guys that I work with, guys and gals, it's a lot of emotional support, because they're doing it tough right now, because there's just there's not that race to kind of go for. So but the majority of them are still ticking over, and it's still healthy for them, I believe, to get that daily dose of training, as long as the stress level is in control. But the training, I think it controls the stress as well. They're happier once they've done it.
Yeah, totally. And I feel the same in that, you were kind of, we are drawn to something like endurance sport in part because we recognize that it's such a good stress relief. But of course, sometimes we are our own worst enemies, and we may, go too hard or do too much because of that. So it's finding that really nice balance, I think, of making sure you're continuing to do your training, but not overdoing it, which I think probably a lot of us did. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself. During the first lockdown, where it was like, right, 4 weeks, boom, I'm out there. I'm going to do some kind of PR with regards to the amount of training I can do. Let's not think about the quality of it, but getting a balance is key.
It needs to continue to be balanced. And this is really why I got Phil to write the chapter, because you really need to, in order to optimize the performance capacity of the individual, is you really have to be doing the other things, I believe, outside of just the training, in order to absorb and adapt the stimulus that you're giving yourself with the training. And if you're not doing that, it just leads to that whole overtraining syndrome thing that we know. So it's just really, again, for the athletes out there, so important to get the stuff away from training right, to really get the most out of yourself.
Totally. And I feel that's really where a coach is super important for people, because you've got the athletes who might do too much, but yet you've got the other athletes who are motivated just to race. And so therefore, without the racing, they're demotivated in their training as well. But if you've got, a group support or a coach that's encouraging you to hit Strava segments, to get on Zwift and do those races and things like that, that's, another way.
We've got so much data these days. It's very easy to quantify sort of where you're at with things. From your math level, your math performance level. Check out Phil's website on all that. To it's more of these your FTP and 5K performance time or whatever. Oh, nice. So these are they're all there for us to chase and get better at. So yeah,
great.
Stay motivated, team. We'll be back racing one day.
That's exactly, I just hope. So finally, Phil, what kind of training are you up to these days?
The weather's changing, and it's a little chilly. It's been freezing, below freezing in the morning the last few days, and so I've reduced. I've kind of gotten rid of the mountain bike and pretty much staying with hiking. I'm among all these great mountain trails, and lesser amounts of running, and I do strength training as well, and so I keep myself busy with those things.
Nice. And Paul, where are you at?
I would say the exact same thing.
Yeah.
All those things. Revelstoke is really sort of famous for mountain biking and skiing as well. So as we transition more to winter, there's epic skiing here, backcountry, downhill, cross country. So I'll just kind of change into a winter athlete. But for now, it's just running, hiking, and mountain biking. The pool, the lake that I live beside is just a little bit too cold at the moment, so it's cooling down. So that the swimming's kind of gone off a bit. That's me.
That's nice. And actually, when we finish up here in a minute or so, I'm just off for a run. We've got Taupo Ultra Marathon coming up in about 3 weeks, and I did this thing where I got into the 50k and then desperately wanted to do 74 until about a week ago. So I've just switched back to the 50 because I realized 74, it's just like I don't need to be out there for that long. I'd rather just kind of tick off 50 and be done with it. So which is actually,
when in doubt, do less. Your brain is saying, hey, maybe 50 is better.
Yeah, that's it, Phil. And I feel like I will run 50 stronger than I will, I'll just kind of ruin myself. Well, no, I won't ruin myself, but I always kind of think ahead, like the recovery from, I'm going to be out there for probably another third of the time, or even actually longer. The recovery is going to be so much more. I'm not actually going to enjoy it. But I need to remind myself that before I get over enthusiastic at the start of the process.
That's such an important thing is that this is supposed to be fun.
Yeah.
And if it's not fun, find something else that you have fun with, move along. Try things you've never tried. Do whatever it takes to enjoy. And I'm not just talking about sports, but everything else in life. Find your passion and go for it.
Totally. And even more so right now where we are, where for some people they've got a lot more time on their hands because they're unable to do the things that they might normally do. It's a good time to explore new opportunities because they're still there. They'll be different to what you might be used to. Hey, Phil and Paul, thank you so much for your time today. And I will pop in the show notes, of course, where people can find you. Hit Science for Paul and philmaffetone.com for Phil. The links to your articles, because regardless of whether or not people are used to reading academic literature, like the way that they're written are just so accessible for people. So
I think that's we've done that. And I've always liked to do that. I learned that because when I used to lecture for courses that doctors would attend, I found that, I need to back off a little bit here, and do plain speak, more so, and they actually appreciate it, and I think the writing of our articles it's written in ways the average person can get a lot out of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And of course, a link to the HIT Science course that Phil contributed to. That sounds like such an amazing resource. And to give it for free, that's super generous. And I think people will really appreciate that. As I appreciate your time and your expertise. And I love it when I see new papers come out from you guys, because I will always learn something, which I love doing. So thanks, team.
And congrats on the new podcast too, Mikki. I look forward to being a regular listener.
Thank you, Paul. Well, I hope you also look forward to being a almost semi-regular contributor.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Mikki. Thanks,
team. So, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Phil and Paul as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you, and those resources that we mentioned in the interview, including the course that Phil wrote for Paul's HIT Science course, and also the Phil's 14-day carb test, will all be linked on the show notes, so absolutely check them out. They're such valuable resources and are so suitable for anyone who is either new in the space of kind of looking at your health and looking at how you might change your diet, or anyone that's just really interested in this space. So next week, team, I have a conversation with my mates Cliff and Bella, answering your questions on nutrition, health and lifestyle related. And I'm really looking forward to bringing that to you, which is the first of many actually with Cliff and of course Bella. And until that time, if you enjoyed this podcast, subscribe on your podcast platform that you listen to it from, and leave a 5-star review. That would be amazing, because that would then allow other people to see the podcast and enjoy it as well, and absolutely pass it on to anyone you feel may enjoy listening to it. Until that time though, you can find me on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Mikki Williden. You can head over on my website to mikkiwilliden.com, where you can find all the information about my online meal plans, such as my longevity diet, my athlete plan, where you get to become part of the Real Food community. We have weekly Q&A forums. I do a weekly email that goes out, and you get meal plan, shopping list, and 24/7 access to individualize that for yourself. And I also do consultations. So until that time, have a great week. Thanks for listening. See you later.